September 17th, 1944, 1,340 hours. Arnhem, Netherlands. Oberst Heinrich Brauer, of the Luftwaffe's 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, lowered his field glasses with barely concealed amusement as he observed the sky darkening with Allied transport aircraft. Through the afternoon haze over the Dutch countryside, hundreds of lumbering C-47 Dakotas approached at low altitude, their ungainly silhouettes presenting what appeared to be easy targets for German anti-aircraft batteries positioned throughout the region. The aircraft flew in predictable patterns, maintaining steady altitudes and speeds that violated every principle of tactical aviation that German doctrine emphasized. "Look at this comedy," Brauer remarked to his operations officer, Hauptmann Klaus Weber, while gesturing toward the approaching armada. "The Americans are using cargo aircraft for military operations. Slow, unarmed transports flying predictable patterns like civilian mail planes. Their logistics desperation has made them reckless beyond comprehension." Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot. His staff nodded in agreement, several officers chuckling at the sight of what appeared to be an ill-conceived aerial supply operation. Through their binoculars, they watched cargo tumbling from the aircraft bays, suspended beneath colorful parachutes that drifted slowly toward designated drop zones. The spectacle seemed almost theatrical in its apparent inefficiency, a desperate improvisation by an enemy whose ground supply lines had become overextended during the rapid advance across France. German military doctrine emphasized ground-based logistics through railway networks and motorized columns-proven systems that had sustained Wehrmacht operations across thousands of kilometers of European territory. Brauer himself had commanded supply at operations during campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, where German logistics efficiency had become legendary among military professionals worldwide. The idea that Americans would attempt to sustain military operations through aerial delivery of supplies seemed to confirm every stereotype about democratic military disorganization and wasteful resource allocation. "Count the aircraft, Weber," Brauer ordered. "Intelligence will want accurate assessments of how many transports the enemy is willing to sacrifice in this foolish operation. When our anti-aircraft batteries finish their work, the Americans will learn that cargo planes make poor substitutes for proper supply columns operating through secure logistics chains." What Brauer could not comprehend as he prepared to engage what appeared to be vulnerable American transport aircraft was that he was witnessing the most revolutionary logistics system ever deployed in military history. Those ungainly cargo planes dropping supplies by parachute represented American industrial capability combined with tactical innovation that would render traditional supply line warfare obsolete. These weren't desperate Americans improvising with inadequate equipment, but the U.S. Army Air Forces executing a systematic logistics transformation that had spent 3 years perfecting aerial resupply techniques capable of sustaining entire armies without ground transportation infrastructure. The canvas bags and supply containers drifting beneath those colorful parachutes contained everything necessary to sustain airborne forces for extended combat operations: ammunition, medical supplies, food rations, communication equipment, and even light vehicles specially packaged for aerial delivery. Each drop had been planned with precision that rivaled German logistical efficiency, with supplies pre-positioned for immediate distribution to units that knew exactly where to recover their designated cargo. The mathematics of aerial logistics were about to demonstrate that national pride in railway efficiency meant nothing when facing enemies who could deliver supplies directly to forward units, regardless of terrain, weather, or enemy interdiction of ground routes. Brauer was watching the future of military logistics unfold before him, but his confidence in traditional German methods prevented recognition of the revolution occurring in the skies above Arnhem. To understand Brauer's contempt, one must first grasp the German military's absolute confidence in their traditional supply systems over American aerial improvisation. By autumn 1944, the Wehrmacht had operated the most sophisticated logistics network in Europe for over 5 years, utilizing railway systems, motorized transport, and supply depots that had sustained military operations from the Atlantic coast to the Volga River distances exceeding 2,500 kilometers that required logistics coordination of unprecedented complexity. German logistics officers had studied supply chain management with the same precision they applied to battlefield tactics, creating organizational structures that treated logistics as a mathematical science rather than improvised necessity. The general staff included specialized logistics planners who calculated supply requirements down to individual rounds of ammunition, liters of fuel, and daily caloric intake for different unit types operating under varying combat conditions. The sounds of German supply operations had become synonymous with military efficiency throughout occupied Europe. The rhythmic clatter of freight trains delivering ammunition and fuel to forward depots, the organized rumble of supply columns moving through predetermined routes, and the systematic distribution of resources through established supply chains that connected frontline units to industrial production deep in the Reich. These sounds represented order, precision, and German organizational superiority over chaotic democratic approaches to military logistics. German supply doctrine emphasized ground-based transportation infrastructure through multiple redundant systems. Primary supply routes utilized railway networks that could move entire divisions with their equipment, vehicles, and supplies along steel rails that had been improved and expanded throughout occupied territories. Secondary routes employed motorized truck columns that maintained consistent delivery schedules along paved highways, connecting supply depots at calculated intervals behind front lines. Tertiary systems used horse-drawn wagons for final distribution to forward positions, where motorized transport became impractical. This multi-layered approach had enabled Wehrmacht operations across distances that exceeded any previous military campaigns in history. During the invasion of France in 1940, German logistics sustained armored spearheads that advanced over 500 kilometers in 6 weeks, while maintaining ammunition, fuel, and food supplies sufficient for sustained offensive operations. The coordination required to keep panzer divisions supplied during rapid advances, while simultaneously supporting infantry divisions following behind, demonstrated German organizational capabilities that awed military observers. Worldwide. The German supply system had proven even more impressive during Operation Barbarossa, where Wehrmacht logistics maintained forces operating across Russian territory that lacked adequate infrastructure. German engineers repaired and expanded railway networks as forces advanced, built supply depots at strategic intervals, and coordinated distribution of resources across thousands of kilometers despite Soviet resistance and partisan attacks on supply lines. That German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow while maintaining operational capability testified to logistics excellence that seemed unmatched by any contemporary military organization. Oberst Brauer himself had commanded supply operations during the North African campaign from 1941 to 1943, where German logistics officers had demonstrated remarkable efficiency despite operating thousands of kilometers from Reich industrial centers. His experience included coordinating maritime supply convoys across the Mediterranean, establishing depot networks in desert terrain lacking infrastructure, and maintaining Rommel's Afrika Korps during mobile operations that covered hundreds of kilometers. The challenges of desert logistics, extreme temperatures, vast distances, limited water sources, and constant Allied air attacks had been overcome through systematic planning and precise execution that reinforced Brauer's belief that traditional ground-based supply chains represented the only reliable method for sustaining military operations. German intelligence assessments consistently described American logistics as wasteful and inefficient, representing typical democratic disorganization, where unlimited resources were applied without systematic planning or tactical sophistication. Intelligence reports noted that American supply operations consumed vast quantities of fuel, equipment, and personnel to accomplish logistics tasks that German forces completed with greater efficiency, using fewer resources. The American tendency to establish massive supply depots overflowing with materials seem to confirm that Americans substituted material abundance for German organizational excellence. While American industrial capacity was acknowledged as substantial, German analysts dismissed American supply methods as brute force logistics, overwhelming problems through sheer volume of resources rather than elegant solutions through systematic planning. Reports described American supply dumps containing mountains of materials far exceeding immediate tactical requirements, representing wasteful accumulation rather than efficient distribution calculated to match consumption rates. The strategic situation in Western Europe during autumn 1944 seemed to confirm German assumptions about American logistics limitations. Despite unlimited industrial production and complete air superiority, Allied forces had struggled to maintain supply lines as they advanced across France following the Normandy breakout. The famous Red Ball Express truck convoys that sustained Patton's Third Army represented exactly the kind of improvised, resource-intensive logistics that German doctrine considered inefficient compared to railway-based systems. American supply difficulties during the rapid advance across France had forced operational pauses that allowed German forces to establish defensive positions and reorganize shattered units. These pauses demonstrated what German officers considered inevitable consequences of inadequate logistics. Planning American forces could advance rapidly when supply lines were short, but operational tempo collapsed when distances exceeded their improvised supply capabilities. The Germans calculated that traditional limitations of ground-based logistics would eventually halt Allied advances regardless of tactical victories, buying time for German defensive preparations that would exploit American logistics vulnerabilities. Brauer's staff had compiled detailed analyses of American supply operations observed during the campaign in France. Their reports noted that American forces consumed supplies at rates exceeding German calculations for equivalent operations, suggesting inefficient resource utilization. American units appeared to waste ammunition through excessive firing rather than precise engagement of targets. They consumed fuel lavishly through constant vehicle operation rather than calculated movement. They established supply depots containing redundant materials rather than streamlined inventories matched to actual requirements. These observations reinforced German confidence that traditional logistics doctrine remained superior despite American material advantages. The idea that Americans would attempt aerial resupply operations represented the culmination of their logistics desperation. Unable to establish proper ground supply chains, they were resorting to wasteful and inefficient aerial delivery that consumed vast aviation resources to deliver supply tonnages that ground transportation could handle more effectively. While German officers dismissed cargo parachutes as desperate improvisation, American logistics planners had spent 3 years systematically developing aerial resupply capabilities that would transform military operations by eliminating dependence on ground transportation infrastructure vulnerable to enemy interdiction and terrain limitations. What appeared to German observers as hasty improvisation actually represented one of the most comprehensive logistics research and development programs in military history. The transformation began with recognition that traditional supply chains created strategic vulnerabilities that determined campaign outcomes regardless of tactical victories. Military theorists had understood since Napoleon's era that armies advanced only as far as supply lines could extend. Railway networks required continuous protection and constant repair after enemy sabotage or air attacks. Roads became bottlenecks that constrained operational tempo when traffic exceeded capacity. Weather and terrain disrupted ground transportation schedules, creating supply shortages that forced operational pauses regardless of tactical opportunities. These fundamental limitations had constrained military operations throughout history. Campaigns stalled when supply lines became overextended. Offensive operations slowed when logistics couldn't maintain pace with advancing forces. Strategic opportunities were lost because commanders couldn't sustain forces beyond reach of established supply chains. Traditional logistics created invisible chains that bound armies to their supply bases, regardless of tactical mobility or operational opportunities. American military planners recognized these limitations while observing German operations during the early war years. The Wehrmacht's impressive advances had been enabled partly by German logistics efficiency, but also constrained by fundamental limitations of ground-based supply chains. German forces in Russia had advanced until supply lines became overextended, then stalled while logistics caught up with forward positions. German operations in North Africa had been limited by maritime supply routes vulnerable to Allied interdiction. Even German logistics excellence couldn't overcome fundamental physics of moving supplies across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory. Colonel Frederick Dent, assigned to the Air Transport Command at Wright Field in Ohio, had been tasked in 1942 with developing procedures for delivering supplies by parachute that would achieve reliability and precision exceeding what German intelligence considered possible for aerial logistics operations. Dent's background combined aviation engineering expertise with logistics planning experience, making him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between air operations and ground supply requirements. Dent's initial research revealed that aerial resupply wasn't entirely new. Isolated experiments had been conducted during earlier conflicts, including limited supply drops during World War I. However, these early efforts had been small-scale improvisations lacking systematic development. What Dent proposed was transforming aerial resupply from experimental technique into core logistics capability that could sustain large military formations during extended operations independent of ground supply lines. The technical challenges of aerial resupply required innovations across multiple integrated systems. Parachutes needed sufficient strength to deliver heavy cargo while achieving gentle enough landing speeds to prevent damage to sensitive equipment. The engineering calculations were complex. Larger parachutes provided gentler landings but created greater air resistance that limited cargo weight, while smaller parachutes allowed heavier loads but increased impact velocity that could destroy fragile supplies. Aircraft required extensive modifications for rapid cargo deployment during low-altitude passes over drop zones. Standard transport aircraft had been designed for cargo loading and unloading at airfields with ground equipment, not for pushing supplies out of aircraft bays while flying at 120 miles per hour and 400 feet altitude. The modifications included reinforced cargo floors that could withstand heavy loads sliding toward open doors, strengthened door frames that could handle stress of open doors during flight, and installation of roller systems that enabled rapid cargo movement during brief passes over drop zones. Supply containers demanded completely new designs that protected contents during aerial descent and rough landings, while remaining light enough to not waste parachute capacity on packaging rather than actual supplies. Engineers developed specialized containers for different cargo types, padded containers for medical supplies and communication equipment, reinforced containers for ammunition that could withstand high-impact landings, insulated containers for food rations and medicine requiring temperature control, and collapsible containers that could be easily disposed of or reused after recovery. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Navigation systems needed accuracy to deliver supplies within designated drop zones regardless of weather, terrain, or enemy action that might prevent visual identification of targets. Early aerial resupply experiments had suffered from supplies scattered across wide areas, making recovery difficult and reducing efficiency. American engineers developed radio beacon systems that guided aircraft to drop zones, visual marker systems that ground units could deploy to identify supply landing areas, and navigation techniques that enabled accurate drops even through cloud cover or during nighttime operations. The C-47 Dakota, dismissed by German observers as merely a civilian transport adapted for military service, had actually been extensively modified specifically for aerial logistics operations. The military version incorporated reinforced cargo doors that could be opened and secured during flight without compromising aircraft structural integrity. Strengthened floor systems supported heavy loads during transport and deployment without risking structural failure. Modified electrical systems powered winches and release mechanisms that enabled precise cargo drops timed to aircraft position over drop zones. American cargo parachute designs evolved through systematic testing programs that addressed performance requirements. German engineers had never considered necessary for military logistics. Early circular parachute designs provided basic descent control, but suffered from instability during windy conditions and unpredictable landing patterns. Engineers developed cruciform parachute designs that provided better stability during descent, then advanced to multi-canopy systems that combined different parachute sizes to optimize descent rates for varying cargo weights. The most sophisticated American parachute systems included directional control capabilities that allowed limited maneuvering during descent. These systems used control lines that ground recovery teams could pull to steer parachutes toward preferred landing zones, compensating for wind drift and improving recovery efficiency. Multiple parachute systems enabled delivery of heavy equipment, including jeeps, artillery pieces, and ammunition pallets weighing over 2,000 pounds cargo types that German doctrine considered impossible to deliver effectively by air. Supply packaging evolved into specialized science, combining engineering precision with practical logistics requirements. Each supply type received custom packaging designed for its specific characteristics. Ammunition was packed in wooden crates with internal cushioning that absorbed impact shock while preventing movement that could cause detonation. Medical supplies were packaged in insulated containers with shock-absorbing materials, protecting fragile glass bottles and sensitive instruments. Food rations were sealed in waterproof containers that prevented contamination during storage, aerial delivery, and ground recovery under field conditions. The packaging systems included visual identification methods that enabled rapid recognition of different supply types after landing. Color-coded parachutes indicated general cargo categories: red for ammunition, white for medical supplies, blue for food rations, yellow for fuel containers. Stenciled markings on containers provided detailed contents information. Sequential numbering systems tracked individual supply bundles through the entire logistics chain, from rear depots through aerial delivery to forward unit recovery. Training programs supporting aerial resupply operations created personnel who understood both aviation requirements and ground logistics needs through comprehensive education that integrated multiple military specialties. Pilots learned low-altitude flying techniques that enabled accurate drops while minimizing aircraft vulnerability to ground fire. The training emphasized precise navigation to designated drop zones, consistent speed and altitude maintenance during cargo deployment, and coordination with ground recovery teams through radio communication. Loadmasters received specialized education in cargo preparation, weight distribution within aircraft, and rapid deployment procedures that maximized delivery rates while maintaining aircraft stability during cargo release. They learned to calculate proper placement of cargo within aircraft bays to maintain center of gravity within safe parameters as cargo was deployed. They practiced rapid deployment sequences that could empty entire aircraft loads in single passes over drop zones lasting only seconds. Ground recovery teams perfected operations that quickly distributed supplies to units requiring immediate resupply. Training emphasized rapid location and recovery of supply bundles, efficient sorting of mixed cargo types delivered to single drop zones, and swift distribution to forward units, minimizing time between delivery and employment. Recovery teams learned to operate under combat conditions, recovering supplies while under enemy fire, and maintaining security of drop zones against enemy attempts to capture American supplies. The systematic development of aerial resupply capabilities represented American industrial and organizational capacity applied to military problem-solving. By 1944, the United States had invested millions of dollars and thousands of personnel hours developing logistics capabilities that German intelligence dismissed as improvised desperation. The cargo parachutes dropping over Arnhem represented the culmination of 3 years of systematic engineering, testing, training, and operational refinement that had transformed experimental technique into reliable core logistics capability. Brauer's first comprehensive encounter with American aerial resupply during the Market Garden operation demonstrated logistics capabilities that exceeded German intelligence assessments and revealed systematic planning that German defensive doctrine had not anticipated or prepared to counter through traditional interdiction methods. What began as amusement at American desperation transformed through horrified recognition into acknowledgement that German logistics doctrine faced obsolescence against opponents who had fundamentally reimagined supply chain and operations. The aerial armada approaching Arnhem on September 17th included over 1,500 transport aircraft and gliders, delivering not merely paratroopers, but complete logistics packages designed to sustain airborne forces independent of ground supply lines for extended operations. Each wave included dedicated cargo aircraft dropping supply containers, equipment bundles, and heavy weapons that would have required dozens of trucks to transport via ground routes vulnerable to interdiction. The initial waves arrived with military precision that contradicted German expectations about American organizational capabilities. Aircraft maintained perfect formation spacing, approached drop zones at identical altitudes and speeds, and deployed cargo with timing suggesting systematic coordination rather than improvised chaos. The spectacle demonstrated planning sophistication that German observers found difficult to reconcile with stereotypes about democratic military inefficiency. The cargo aircraft are dropping supplies in designated zones with apparent precision, reported Hauptmann Weber, coordinating anti-aircraft operations from his command post. The parachute systems appear more sophisticated than intelligence assessments suggested. Multiple parachute configurations are delivering varying cargo types with precision, despite our defensive fire and adverse wind conditions affecting the drop zones. German anti-aircraft batteries engaged the slow-moving transports with enthusiasm, believing they faced target-rich environment of vulnerable aircraft flying predictable patterns at low altitudes. Several C-47 seconds were hit, trailing smoke as they struggled to maintain altitude long enough to complete cargo drops. Some aircraft crashed in flames, their crews dying to ensure supplies reached designated zones. Yet the majority of transports completed their missions despite German fire, demonstrating determination that exceeded what Brauer had expected from American logistics personnel. What shocked German observers more than American willingness to accept casualties was the systematic organization visible in the aerial logistics operations. Different colored parachutes indicated specific cargo types, enabling rapid identification and recovery by ground units. Red parachutes marked ammunition bundles, white parachutes indicated medical supplies. Blue parachutes designated food rations. Yellow parachutes identified fuel containers. The color coding system demonstrated planning sophistication that contradicted German assumptions about American improvisation. Supply containers were pre-packaged for immediate distribution, eliminating sorting and repackaging required when supplies arrived via traditional ground transportation. Each container included stenciled markings identifying contents, intended recipients, and priority levels. Ground recovery teams could identify their unit's supplies visually from distances exceeding 100 meters, enabling rapid recovery without time-consuming inventory procedures that characterized traditional supply operations. Radio beacons guided aircraft to drop zones even when visual observation was limited by terrain or weather. Ground units activated beacons that transmitted directional signals aircraft navigators used to locate precise drop coordinates. The system enabled accurate supply delivery during nighttime operations, through cloud cover, and in contested areas where visual markers might reveal positions to enemy observation. The technological sophistication exceeded what German forces employed for their own supply operations, much less what German intelligence had expected from American logistics improvisation. The accuracy demonstrated by American aerial drops exceeded German expectations about what could be achieved from aircraft flying at tactical speeds under combat conditions. Supply containers landed within designated zones measuring only 200 meters square, despite aircraft traveling at 120 miles per hour and deploying cargo from altitudes of 400 feet. The precision rivaled what ground supply convoys achieved when delivering to designated supply points, while aerial delivery eliminated transportation time and vulnerability during extended transit through hostile territory. Individual drop zones received carefully calculated supply loads matched to units operating in specific sectors. Airborne infantry units received ammunition, rations, and medical supplies proportioned for their personnel strength and expected combat intensity. Artillery units received ammunition, replacement equipment, and specialized supplies for maintaining their weapons. Combat engineers received explosives, construction materials, and specialized tools. The systematic distribution demonstrated understanding of unit requirements that contradicted German assumptions about American logistics operating through crude abundance rather than precise calculation. The volume of supplies delivered by aerial means exceeded German calculations about what transport aircraft could accomplish during sustained operations. Individual C-47 aircraft dropped between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds of supplies during single passes over drop zones, then returned to forward bases for reloading and subsequent missions. The cycle repeated throughout daylight hours, with some aircraft completing 3 or 4 supply missions in single days. The cumulative tonnage delivered by aerial resupply approached what German ground supply columns required weeks to accumulate through traditional railway and motorized transport. During the first 3 days of market garden operations, American aerial logistics delivered over 5,000 tons of supplies directly to airborne forces operating beyond reach of ground transportation. The equivalent tonnage would have required over 800 truck trips along vulnerable supply routes subject to enemy interdiction. Brauer watched through field glasses as American recovery teams operated with efficiency that demonstrated thorough training. Ground personnel moved quickly to drop zones, identified their designated supply bundles through visual markings, and distributed contents to forward units within hours of delivery. The speed of recovery operations denied German forces opportunities to capture supply bundles, despite multiple attempts to seize drop zones before American forces secured them. The psychological impact on German observers exceeded tactical concerns about American supplies reaching intended recipients. Watching enemies receive daily aerial resupply, regardless of German control over ground routes, revealed American capability to sustain operations, independent of traditional logistics vulnerabilities that German defensive doctrine assumed, would constrain Allied advances. If Americans could supply forces through aerial delivery, German strategies based on interdicting ground supply lines became irrelevant against opponents who had eliminated that fundamental vulnerability. This is not improvised logistics, Brauer admitted to his operations staff after observing 3 days of American aerial resupply operations. This represents systematic development of alternative supply methods that bypass traditional infrastructure we assumed essential for sustained military operations. The Americans have apparently invested years developing capabilities we dismissed as impossible or impractical for sustaining large formations during extended combat operations. The statistics emerging from American aerial resupply operations during Market Garden and subsequent campaigns revealed logistics capabilities that exceeded what German ground-based systems could accomplish even under optimal conditions without enemy interdiction or infrastructure damage. The numerical comparisons demonstrated why German confidence in traditional logistics represented fatal miscalculation when facing opponents who had fundamentally reimagined supply chain operations through aerial delivery. American C-47 cargo capacity. Each aircraft carried between 6,000 and 7,500 pounds of supplies per sortie, deliverable directly to forward units without requiring ground transportation infrastructure, enabling resupply of units operating beyond reach of traditional logistics chains. The payload capacity equaled approximately what 3 2.5-ton trucks could carry, but with critical difference that aircraft could complete delivery in hours rather than days required for ground convoys to traverse similar distances. German truck column capacity. Standard German supply columns organized around 50 vehicles could transport approximately 125 tons of supplies, similar total tonnage to what 20 C-47 sorties delivered. However, truck convoys required intact roads, fuel supplies for round-trip journeys averaging 200 to 300 kilometers, protection against air attack throughout extended transit times, and time-consuming loading procedures at supply depots, plus unloading procedures at forward distribution points. The time calculations revealed fundamental advantages of aerial logistics. German truck columns required 24 to 48 hours to complete supply delivery cycles from rear depots to forward units and return to depots for reloading. The extended timeline included travel time, loading and unloading procedures, rest periods for drivers, and delays caused by traffic congestion, road conditions, and enemy action. In contrast, C-47 aircraft completed equivalent delivery cycles in 4 to 6 hours, including flight time, cargo deployment, and return to bases for reloading. Aerial delivery speed. C-47 aircraft flew from rear bases to forward drop zones at cruising speeds of 160 miles per hour, covering distances of 100 to 200 miles in less than 90 minutes. Cargo deployment over drop zones required only 30 to 60 seconds per aircraft, as loadmasters pushed supply bundles through cargo doors during single passes over designated zones. Return flights to bases required equivalent time, enabling aircraft to complete entire supply delivery cycles in timeframes that German truck convoys needed, merely to reach halfway points along their routes. Ground convoy speed. German motorized supply columns advanced at average speeds of 20 to 30 miles per hour along roads. Slower, when traffic congestion or poor road conditions reduced progress. The speed differential meant aerial logistics could deliver equivalent tonnages in 1/6 the time required for ground transportation, fundamentally changing operational tempo by eliminating delays traditionally imposed by supply chain limitations. Supply delivery accuracy. American parachute systems achieved drop zone accuracy within 100 to 300 meters under normal conditions, sufficient for efficient recovery by ground units positioned to secure drop zones. This precision rivaled what ground convoys could achieve when delivering to designated supply points, while aerial delivery eliminated transportation time and vulnerability during transit through potentially hostile territory. The accuracy statistics became more impressive when considering that aerial drops occurred from aircraft traveling at 120 miles per hour and releasing cargo from altitudes of 300 to 500 feet. The ballistic calculations required for accurate placement factored wind speed and direction, aircraft velocity and altitude, cargo weight and parachute configuration, and terrain elevation at drop zones. American loadmasters performed these calculations routinely, achieving consistent accuracy that enabled reliable supply delivery, regardless of conditions that would halt ground transportation. Operational flexibility. Aerial resupply could deliver supplies regardless of terrain conditions, bridge destruction, road interdiction, or weather that would halt ground transportation. American logistics planners could sustain forward units even when enemy forces controlled territory between supply bases and frontline forces, eliminating traditional vulnerability of extended supply lines to enemy interdiction. The flexibility advantage became most apparent in situations where ground supply routes faced disruption. When German forces destroyed bridges, aerial logistics simply overflew the obstacles that would halt truck convoys for days while engineers completed repairs. When enemy forces controlled territory astride supply routes, aircraft delivered supplies directly to isolated units that ground convoys couldn't reach. When weather conditions made roads impassable, aerial delivery continued using instrument navigation and radio beacons that enabled operations independent of visibility. German military doctrine had assumed that weather conditions affecting air operations would neutralize aerial logistics during periods when ground transportation remained feasible. However, American operational experience demonstrated that aerial delivery could continue during conditions that severely degraded ground transportation efficiency. Light rain that turned unpaved roads into mud that slowed convoys to crawling speeds barely affected aircraft operations. Fog that reduced visibility for ground drivers to dangerous levels didn't prevent aircraft from using instrument navigation to reach drop zones marked by radio beacons. Production statistics. The industrial capacity supporting aerial logistics revealed American manufacturing capability applied to systematic development of specialized equipment at scales that German intelligence had considered impossible for producing military equipment requiring precision engineering rather than crude mass production. Parachute production. American industry manufactured over 2 million cargo parachutes during war years, with designs ranging from small personnel chutes to massive systems capable of delivering vehicles and artillery pieces weighing several tons. Production rates exceeded 100,000 parachutes monthly by 1944, enabling aerial logistics operations at scales that German military planners had dismissed as theoretically impossible, given resource requirements for manufacturing so many specialized items. The parachute production statistics represented industrial capability that German planners found difficult to comprehend. Each cargo parachute required over 100 square meters of specialized silk or nylon fabric, manufactured to precise specifications, ensuring consistent strength and deployment characteristics. Production included cutting fabric panels to exact dimensions, sewing panels into canopy configurations using reinforced stitching patterns, and installing suspension lines rated for specific load capacities. The precision manufacturing requirements seemed inconsistent with mass production methods, yet American industry achieved both quality and quantity through systematic production techniques. Aircraft availability. The United States produced over 10,000 C-47 Dakota aircraft during war years, with many dedicated specifically to logistics operations. This manufacturing capacity enabled aerial supply operations on scales that German intelligence had considered impossible for specialized military aircraft, requiring precision engineering and skilled assembly labor. The aircraft production statistics exceeded German manufacturing capability for comparable aircraft by factors of 10 or more. While German industry struggled to maintain production of a few hundred transport aircraft annually, American factories delivered thousands of C-47 seconds while simultaneously producing bombers, fighters, and other military aircraft in quantities that seemed impossible for single industrial economy to achieve. The production volume demonstrated industrial capacity that made aerial logistics feasible at operational scales rather than merely experimental or emergency measures. Supply container development. American engineers designed dozens of specialized containers for different cargo types during systematic development programs that treated packaging as engineering discipline, requiring same precision as aircraft or weapons design. Insulated containers for medical supplies, maintained temperature control during aerial transit and ground storage. Reinforced containers for ammunition withstood high-impact landings without risking detonation. Cushioned containers protected sensitive equipment from shock loads during parachute deployment and landing. Modular containers could be quickly assembled into different configurations for varying payloads, enabling efficient use of aircraft cargo space. The container development program represented investment of engineering resources that German doctrine would have considered wasteful over-specialization. German supply operations used standardized wooden crates and metal containers for most cargo types, emphasizing simplicity and ease of manufacture over specialized optimization. American willingness to develop dozens of container types for specific cargo categories demonstrated commitment to systematic optimization that achieved maximum efficiency through precise matching of packaging to contents. The psychological transformation of German logistics officers from contempt to recognition of American aerial superiority revealed the personal impact of discovering that traditional supply doctrine meant nothing when facing opponents who had eliminated fundamental vulnerabilities of ground-based logistics chains. The recognition process extended beyond intellectual acknowledgement of American capabilities to emotional acceptance that German logistics expertise had become obsolete against enemies employing revolutionary methods that bypassed rather than improved traditional supply systems. As Allied advances continued through autumn 1944 and into 1945, German forces increasingly experienced supply shortages that American aerial logistics never encountered, despite similar or worse tactical situations. Wehrmacht units found themselves isolated when Allied air power interdicted ground supply routes, while American forces operating in comparable circumstances simply radioed for aerial resupply that arrives within hours regardless of ground situation. The contrast became most stark during operations where German and American forces operated in close proximity while experiencing vastly different logistics situations. German units struggled with ammunition shortages, inadequate rations, and equipment lacking replacement parts because supply convoys couldn't reach forward positions through Allied air attacks and ground interdiction. Meanwhile, American units in adjacent sectors received daily aerial resupply that maintained ammunition stocks, provided hot rations, and delivered replacement equipment that kept vehicles and weapons operational. Major Hans Schmidt, a German supply officer captured during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, provided testimony during interrogation that revealed German recognition of American logistics superiority. We watched American units surrounded by our forces receive daily aerial resupply, while our own troops starved because supply columns couldn't reach us through enemy territory. The Americans had eliminated the fundamental weakness of traditional logistics dependence on continuous ground routes between supply bases and forward units. Schmidt's testimony described specific incidents where German forces had surrounded American units, cutting ground supply routes and expecting starvation would force surrender within days following traditional siege warfare principles. Instead, American forces received aerial resupply that maintained combat effectiveness indefinitely. German attacks against these surrounded American positions encountered enemies with full ammunition loads, adequate food, and maintained equipment, despite having no ground connection to rear supply bases. The psychological impact on German soldiers watching enemies receive supplies that German forces couldn't interdict proved devastating to morale. Schmidt described watching cargo parachutes descending to American positions while German anti-aircraft fire failed to stop transport aircraft that continued missions despite battle damage. The spectacle demonstrated American material superiority combined with tactical innovation that made German efforts to exploit traditional logistics vulnerabilities futile against opponents who had eliminated those vulnerabilities through systematic application of aerial resupply capabilities. Medical examinations of captured German soldiers consistently revealed malnutrition and equipment shortages, even in units theoretically positioned within supply range of German depots, still connected to functioning railway networks. Meanwhile, American prisoners captured during the same engagements showed evidence of adequate nutrition and proper equipment, demonstrating effectiveness of aerial logistics even under adverse tactical conditions, where ground supply lines faced constant disruption. German military doctors examining their own casualties noted declining physical condition of Wehrmacht personnel compared to earlier war years when German logistics had maintained soldier health at levels, ensuring combat effectiveness. The deterioration reflected not merely Allied strategic bombing of German industrial capacity, but fundamental logistics failure as traditional supply chains proved inadequate for sustaining forces operating against enemies who could interdict ground transportation while maintaining their own supply operations through aerial delivery. Letters from German soldiers to families, censored but preserved in military archives, consistently described American supply advantages that contradicted German propaganda about democratic inefficiency and material weakness. The enemy receives fresh supplies from the sky, while we scavenge ammunition from casualties and supplement rations with whatever we can forage from the countryside. Their logistics system operates independent of roads we could interdict or railways we could destroy through sabotage operations. The letters revealed soldier-level recognition that American aerial logistics had fundamentally changed warfare in ways that German doctrine couldn't counter. While German propaganda emphasized heroic resistance and inevitable victory through superior will and tactical excellence, frontline soldiers recognized they faced enemies whose systematic logistics advantages made German tactical skills irrelevant when lacking adequate supplies to sustain combat operations. One letter from an anonymous German soldier captured near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge described the psychological impact with particular clarity. We hear the American transport planes flying overhead every day, dropping supplies to their surrounded units. Our officers tell us the Americans are trapped and will surrender soon, but the Americans receive more supplies by air than we receive through our supply columns on open roads. Who is really trapped, the Americans inside the encirclement receiving daily aerial resupply, or us outside the encirclement watching our own supplies run out while unable to prevent enemy resupply operations? The morale impact on German forces extended beyond material shortages to systematic doubt about German ability to achieve military objectives against opponents who could sustain operations, regardless of tactical situation or infrastructure control. Traditional German doctrine emphasized that defensive operations could exploit Allied logistics vulnerabilities by interdicting supply lines and forcing operational pauses that allowed German forces to establish defensive positions. This doctrine became meaningless against American forces whose aerial logistics eliminated dependence on vulnerable ground supply chains. German soldiers began questioning official narratives about inevitable victory when their personal observations contradicted propaganda claims. If German forces were superior in training, equipment, and tactical skill as propaganda insisted, why did American forces consistently maintain better supply status despite German efforts to interdict their logistics? The contradiction between propaganda and reality created cognitive dissonance that eroded confidence in military leadership and strategic direction. What German officers initially dismissed as desperate American improvisation proved to be the most revolutionary logistics development in military history, a system that would influence military planning for generations and render traditional supply chain warfare fundamentally obsolete. The implications extended far beyond immediate tactical advantages during World War II to a strategic transformation of how military forces could be sustained, deployed, and employed in conflicts where traditional logistics infrastructure was unavailable or vulnerable to enemy interdiction. The most dramatic demonstration of aerial logistics capabilities came during the Berlin airlift of 1948–1949, where the same systems and techniques German officers had mocked during World War II proved capable of sustaining an entire city through aerial resupply when Soviet forces blocked ground access. The operation represented the ultimate validation of an idea born not in comfort or theory, but in the crucible of wartime necessity. Over the course of 11 months, Allied aircraft delivered more than 2 million tons of food, coal, and supplies to the citizens of West Berlin. The success was not merely a triumph of aviation, it was a triumph of logistical imagination. In the skies above divided Berlin, hundreds of aircraft formed an unbroken chain of flight. Every 3 minutes, another transport landed at Tempelhof or Gatow airfield, unloaded its cargo, and took off again. Precision timing and mechanical reliability were essential. Any disruption risked catastrophe. Yet, the system worked, transforming air transport from a supplemental capability into a full-fledged strategic tool. The lessons of the Berlin airlift reshaped NATO doctrine, influencing how Western powers planned and executed operations for decades to come. It proved that supply lines could be defended not only by land or sea, but by mastery of the air. The origins of this transformation traced back to World War II innovations like the U.S. Army Air Force's Red Ball Express in the European theatre, and the massive aerial supply operations over the Himalayas known as the Hump. American forces had learned to deliver fuel, ammunition, and rations to advancing armies far beyond the range of railheads or seaports. This mobility allowed commanders to sustain offensives at a pace their adversaries could not match. German and Japanese logistics systems, rooted in fixed depots and rail lines, were simply incapable of keeping up. By the end of the war, the concept of air mobility had expanded to include not only cargo, but also personnel, and even entire combat units. Airborne divisions could be dropped behind enemy lines, resupplied from the sky, and extracted when missions were complete. The helicopter, first used experimentally in the 1942nd, would later evolve into the centerpiece of mobile warfare during conflicts in Korea and Vietnam. The seeds of that revolution were planted in the logistics innovations of the 1942nd. In the decades that followed, military planners refined and expanded aerial logistics into a global network of rapid response capability. The U.S. Air Mobility Command, for instance, could deliver troops and materiel anywhere in the world within hours. Cargo aircraft like the C-141 Starlifter, C-5 Galaxy, and later the C-17 Globemaster III became the backbone of this system. Massive, versatile platforms that turned the planet into a manageable operational space. The same logistical philosophy that sustained Berlin now underpinned humanitarian aid operations, disaster response missions, and global deterrence strategies. Beyond the military sphere, the revolution in logistics transformed the civilian world. Concepts pioneered in wartime like just-in-time delivery, rapid air freight, and centralized tracking laid the foundation for the modern global supply chain. Corporations such as FedEx and UPS borrowed directly from military logistics models, creating commercial systems that mirrored the precision and reliability of wartime airlift operations. In a sense, every express delivery, every overnight shipment, is a descendant of the strategies that once fed a besieged city in post-war Europe. Yet the deeper impact of the strategic logistics revolution was philosophical as much as practical. It redefined the relationship between distance, time, and power. No longer did the geography of supply determine the limits of strategy. Air mobility made it possible to project force and sustain operations anywhere, even in the most hostile environments. It also forced adversaries to rethink how they waged war. Striking an enemy's supply lines no longer guaranteed crippling their capability. Logistics had become not merely a support function, but a decisive weapon in itself. Today, as unmanned aerial systems and autonomous logistics vehicles enter the battlefield, the legacy of that mid-20th century transformation continues to evolve. The core principle remains unchanged. Flexibility, speed, and innovation in supply can shape the outcome of wars as profoundly as the weapons themselves. The strategic revolution that began as an emergency response to broken supply lines has become the defining feature of modern warfare, proof that in the art of conflict, those who master movement and sustenance hold the true keys to victory. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.